What's up everyone, it's Delete, and today in Juno New Origins we're going to be talking about solid rockets. Specifically, we're going to be talking about the different types of fuel grain you can use when designing a solid rocket that'll make it behave differently during flight. So what a fuel grain is essentially the pattern that is cut into the actual solid propellant inside the rocket. If you've ever seen a diagram of a solid rocket, you'll see that there is a hole in the center where the actual chemical reaction, the combustion of the fuel, occurs. And the surface area of that hole determines how much thrust the rocket's going to be producing. The smaller your surface area, the less thrust the rocket's going to produce during flight. And the shape of that hole is going to determine how the surface area changes with time. If you think about it, the longer that rocket burns, the more that hole expands. So if you have just a circle for the hole inside your rocket, as it expands, the surface area is going to increase because the circumference of that circle is going to increase with the size. But if you cut a cross or a star shape into your fuel, the surface area is not going to change at a constant rate, and in fact, it can get very complicated depending on the geometry of your fuel grain. So, in this video, we're going to be testing different geometries and how they impact your thrust over time. So what I've done to test the different fuel grains is I built this little test stand. So this block here is very heavy. I think it weighs 28 tons and then another 10 tons. So you're looking at 30 tons of mass here, which is going to keep the rocket from moving around. We have a small solid rocket motor here on the end. Now it is very small. It's actually as small as I can make it, and I made the nozzle as small as possible because I don't really care what the max thrust is here. All I'm going to be looking at is how the fuel grain setting here changes the thrust over time. So right now I have this set to ramp up, but there's also the steady fuel grain, ramp down, impulse, and then the basic fuel grain. The basic is the default fuel grain when you drop a rocket into the game. So if you don't change it, you're going to get this basic thrust profile. I've set up a couple of Visi scripts inside this craft. So one of these Visi scripts is going to be running the lights and some of the more cosmetic stuff, but the thing that really matters here is this script right here. What this script does is logs the engine thrust to the flight log every second. So every 1 second, the flight log is going to update with the current engine thrust, and then we're going to look at the max thrust at the end of the flight and see which one had the highest peak and which one burned the longest, and what those actual profiles look like over time. Do they start low, go high? Do they start high, go low? Are they relatively constant? That's what we're going to find out in this experiment. So here we are at the Alley Base rocket launch stand, which was where we are going to be testing our rockets out. And I've also made this rocket test stand available to everyone on the Simple Rockets website. So if you have Juno New Origins, you can go to the Simple Rockets website and you can download this and try it out for yourself. You can test out your own engines, maybe customize the Visi script if you think you could do better, or you want to see different variables and values in your tests. So that is available to everyone, free to download, so you should go check it out on my page on the website. Now, without further ado, let's get to the tests. So after running each of those tests, I went to Google Sheets and threw all this information into a Excel spreadsheet. So here you can see the test for time on the left column, and then the right column here is the thrust in newtons for each of the tests. And we have our first test, which was the basic, and then ramp down, the ramp up, impulse, and last was steady. And then from that raw data, I plotted it on a graph here so you can see over time how each of these thrust curves change. Now, I think the most interesting ones are the ramp up and the ramp down, and you can see very clearly what's happening here. It starts at a constant value, so basically 20,000 newtons or 20 kilonewtons of thrust here for the ramp up, and then it increases, gradually peaks out around 50,000 newtons and then drops off rapidly at the end. And then for the ramp down, it is pretty much the exact opposite, or a mirror of that. So it starts at around 50,000 and then slowly decreases to 20,000 and then drops off at the end. The basic curve is probably the most interesting to look at and maybe the most random. So it increases at the start in a kind of choppy manner, and then it decreases, comes back to a peak, and then goes down and then levels out here at the bottom. The steady fuel grain does exactly what it advertises. It goes up to about 50,000, burns at a constant rate, absolutely no change, and then drops off at the end. And it also burned for the shortest period of time, which I'll get into in a minute here. And then last but not least, we have the impulse fuel grain, which you can see it goes off the side of the graph here and then plummets back down to a very low value, and then it burns at this lower value for a while before dropping off. And I have a second graph here that's plotted to scale for the impulse. As you can see, the impulse fuel grain burns almost all of its fuel right at the beginning, and then very, very slowly burns the last little bit of fuel here at the end. The other thing that's important to look at is the total amount of momentum that each of these different fuel grains imparted on our test stand. So momentum can be thought of as force times time. It can also be thought of as mass times velocity. And you'll notice that these fuel types really aren't different. Basic, ramp up, ramp down, and steady all pretty much have the same momentum. Slight variations that I think are mostly due to error, but they're all relatively constant. The only one that is lower is the impulse stage, and I think that that is actually due to low resolution with our sample frequency. So the Visi script is sampling once every second, and you'll see here that there isn't really a peak. There are two high points, but if this was a smooth curve, then it actually should come higher up on this graph. So there is more force here that we missed during the test that would actually raise our impulse graph, and I would theorize that these graphs are all roughly the same amount of momentum. And it's not going to change much between each of them. And then the variations that we are seeing here are mostly due to testing error and accuracy of the program and the physics simulation as it runs. Well, for starters, if we're designing a launch vehicle, generally we're going to want a lot of thrust early on at the beginning, and then we're going to want that thrust to taper off as we burn fuel and burn mass. We don't need as much force to accelerate our rocket. So the ramp down fuel grain is actually perfect, and I would recommend using it for most launch vehicles. You get your highest thrust at the beginning, and then it tapers off and slows down over time, and you get this nice, smooth acceleration curve, because as you burn fuel, you're actually lowering your mass, and you don't need as much force to accelerate, so having a lower thrust at the end is perfectly fine, and you get this nice long burn time. On the other hand, if you want a kick stage, something that's going to accelerate your rocket really fast, but doesn't burn for very long and you can move on to other stages, the impulse stage actually does a really good job of that. You get all your force right at the beginning, and then it'll burn for a little bit while longer, but you really can ignore it at that point and move on to a different stage or a different set of engines. The only other fuel grain that I would really recommend is the steady fuel grain. It gives you a very nice, consistent, flat thrust. It's very predictable, which makes it perfect if you're going to use a solid rocket to impart a very specific amount of force on your rocket. If you want to know exactly how much force and how much momentum your rocket's going to get, use the steady fuel grain. Of these, definitely the basic fuel grain is the worst. It's unpredictable, has this weird shape to it that isn't really useful. It kind of ramps down, so it's similar in its characteristics to the ramp down, but there's this long spool up time. So the first couple of seconds of burn, you're actually not at your peak thrust, which means If you have a rocket that is very heavy and has a low thrust to weight ratio, you're not even going to start accelerating until the couple seconds into the burn. The only real reason you're going to use the basic fuel grain is in the career mode if you haven't unlocked the other better fuel grains. Well, everyone, I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please like and subscribe to the channel for more Simple Rockets 2 content. I'm going to be making more videos like this in the future, explaining some of the more niche or advanced concepts with designing rockets. Thank you again for watching. Leave a comment below if you would like to see a specific topic covered in a future video, and I will see you later. Take care.